Hi, Misha here, and this is part 3, looking at Soviet-Russian fighter aircraft from the Great Patriotic War in 1/72 scale diecast. In the first part, we looked at the I-16 and the MiG-3, and in the second part, we looked at the LA series, LA-5, LA-7, and now we will check out the Yaks. And we'll cover Yak-1, but then we'll get into the Yak-7, Yak-9, and the Yak-3, which actually came later than the Yak-9, because that's apparently how the numbers work. Hey, if Stalin says it's how it works, it's how it works. And Yakovlev was kind of his favorite, at least before and at the beginning of World War II. So with that, let's just dive right in. The MiG was originally known as the I-200, and the Lag-1, Lag-3 was originally known as the I-301, and the Yakovlev was originally known as the I-26. And this was another one of the things to come out of the conference in 1939. In fact, these were really the three main designs. About a dozen design bureaus were tasked with creating a modern fighter, but MiG, Yak, and Lavochkin would be the ones that would actually produce. And Alexei Yakovlev was kind of a star, if you will. He was favored by Stalin. He already had a claim before the war in designing sporting, kind of racing, aerobatic aircraft. And so he had a bit of a leg up. And this resulted in the Yak-1, and the similar story to the other two. And the Yak-1 was not without its flaws and issues, but like the others, it was kind of put into production as quick as possible, and did begin to see service in 1941, but production was delayed after the Germans, and things get interesting. We could talk here a lot about this, but here we have the Yak-9T. My other one here is a Yak-3, and you would think 3 would come before 9, but not necessarily. The Yak-1 kind of splits off, and originally they're creating a 2-seat trainer. This essentially evolves into the Yak-7, which is put into production, is a multi-role aircraft, and of that, the Yak-7B would be turned into the lightweight Yak-7DI prototype, which eventually would become the Yak-9. And this would first fly in mid-1942 and be placed into production in around October of that year. And it was available for use during the Battle of Kursk in 1943. So it did see service at the end of 1942 and was becoming more and more available in 1943. And even then, with the Yak-9, there were a lot of variants. There were over 15 different ones, a couple of different wing types, several fuel tank arrangements. There were multiple armament configurations, including this one here, the Yak-9T, or T for anti-tank. And this really was a multi-role fighter. It was used as an interceptor, but it was also used to hit ground targets. So what do we have here? Well, size-wise, it's much like our other aircraft. It's about 28 feet long, with a wingspan just shy of 32 feet, give or take which exact model we're on. Performance-wise, it's about a 35,000 foot altitude. And yet again, at altitude, it has a max speed, depending on the model, of about 400 to 420 miles per hour. So it's kind of right in there. And like the others, it was a combination of wood and metal. And as time would go on, more aluminum would be used and steel and less wood. Although some versions would use a kind of a Bakelite coating, which is kind of cool. And there'd be 2-seat and single seats and all kinds of fun stuff. This version here. Now originally, the Yak-9 had a 20mm cannon. They would actually fire through the center of the propeller hub. Quite an interesting way of doing things. And then it had one 12.7mm or 50 caliber machine gun in the cowling above it. It could also carry some ordnance under the wings. This version here replaces the 20mm cannon with a 37mm cannon and still has the 150 caliber machine gun. And this cannon was very good for hitting tanks and other pieces of armor on the ground. It was also found to be quite effective as an anti-shipping aircraft on the Black Sea. Also, because the aircraft had quite decent maneuverability and performance, it was a good anti-bomber plane. A couple of hits with that cannon would take out a bomber. And for skilled pilots, one hit would take out a fighter. And these were able to go up against the Bf-109G and even some of the earlier Focke-Wulf FW-190s. It was a durable aircraft, and and this is really where the Russian idea of mounting all the guns right on the center line for easy aiming takes place, but it still has relatively limited ammo, and it doesn't have the best range in the world, but keep in mind they were fighting a defensive war. But yeah, this is becoming more and more common throughout 43 and 44, and it would earn the NATO reporting name of Frank because service would continue up through 1952, about when Russia started to retire most all of its piston aircraft. But even production would continue through 1947, 1948, depending on which source you look at. And for the Yak-9, they would build over 16,700. So, yeah, that's a pretty big number. So it was one of the most produced. It might have been the most produced single model fighter for Russia in the war, and really one of the most successful. And it actually was a very good multi-role aircraft because of all the versions. Now, the preeminent fighter version was the Yak-9U, which first flew at the end of 43 and was put into production and service in 1944. And this would continue the design, giving even more modern radio and giving better visibility for the pilot. And it would actually go to two 50 caliber machine guns in the cowling, plus the 20mm cannon. And it was actually one of these Yak-9s on March 22nd, 1945, they would successfully challenge and shoot down a Messerschmitt Me-262, a jet fighter. Unfortunately, the pilot's victory was very short-lived when the 262's wingmen would in turn down the Yak, but still yet, there aren't many piston aircraft that can claim to have shot down a jet, irrespective of anything else. That is quite an achievement. So this is kind of, it was based on the Yak-1, but it was turned into something not as heavy-hitting and not as ground attack-oriented as, say, the IL-2, but certainly more in the heavy, bulky role. Even though, it's still not huge. But our Yak-3 is kind of seeing the design go in the other direction. Many might consider the Yak-3 the most successful, even the best, Soviet fighter of the war. And yeah, whereas the Yak-9 was more of a multi-role fighter, interceptor, anti-bomber, this was more of a true, dedicated dogfighter, low to medium altitude, and was just a very small, light little aircraft, not unlike the I-16 from long before. Now this goes back all the way to 1939-1940. The Russian Air Force had suffered more than a few losses because of Spain and China intervening there, and they lost 1,000 aircraft, all told, in Finland during the Winter War. This put them in a very precarious position in 1940, and explains a lot of what's going on. Now, they had probably the most of these MiG-3s. The Lag-3, while it was entering into production, it was very underwhelming, leaving maybe the Yak-1 as the best, most useful fighter they had during Operation Barbarossa. But unfortunately, they only had about 500 in service at that time, and of those, many hadn't reached the front. In fact, only about 100 were fully operational with trained pilots and all that. But they saw service in 1941, the Yak-1 that is, and they would produce them in large numbers, well over 8,000. But they would work on the Yak-1M, an improved version that got away from using as much wood. Much like with the others, the original Yak-1 was a combination of wood and metal, a composite design. With the Yak-1M, they went to more metal, more aluminum there, kind of the modern take. And they shrunk it down, trying to improve maneuverability, giving it more power. This would fly in 43, and the Yak-1M would enter into production as the Yak-3 in early 1944, first seeing combat that spring and into summer. And even though production would only last through about 1946, they would build quite the number of these, about 5,000, and they would see use after the war, really not being retired until around 1950, 1951. And both the Yak-3 and Yak-9 would be loaned or given to Allied nations, including a large number of Yak-3s being flown by the Free French. But what do we have here? Well, size-wise, we're about the same. A little under 28 foot long. Our wingspan's a little smaller, just about 30 feet. Speed-wise, we're kind of like the rest, around 410 at max altitude. And that tends to be around 35,000 feet, so much like the rest. Armament-wise, it started off with one 20mm cannon, again firing through the center of the propeller, and then we had one 12.7mm machine gun up on top. But very soon, with Yak-3 production, that would be supplemented by a second 50 cal machine gun, so a total of 2 plus the 20mm. Meaning it had a decent punch, at least right in its nose, but the trade-off was it was a very light and nimble aircraft, quite durable, and aside from some issues with the engines, quite reliable too, and more advanced than previous aircraft. But yeah, these were kind of the permanent fighters for the last year of the war, and really the ultimate culmination of the Yakovlev design, at least in terms of being a pure dogfighter. whereas again, the Yak-9s were more multi-role. And it's certainly an iconic aircraft of the Soviet era, and did see some limited use during the early days of, say, the Korean War, before jets really took over. And that's really when MiG would finally take over. But for World War II, yeah, it was the Yak and the WWII, WWII that were the prime Russian fighters. And I think you kind of see, it's really interesting how these are very much of a similar performance level and design aesthetic. In a way, not a lot of variation. And we can definitely tell the transition more from wood to metal as the fortunes of war would change. And again, if Russia didn't divide their planes up, if they just considered Yak, Mark I, Mark III, there would be so many of these aircraft, of any of them, except for the MiG. But because of the way they split them up, difference. But yeah, I just thought it would be a good time to really talk about the different Russian aircraft, because it is hard to find them in 1/72 scale diecast. This one is from Atlas. Of course, it's the IXO tooling. And the Yak-9, it just came in, and it is from De Agostini. But again, the same basic tooling as IXO was used for a long time. And I would say, yeah, for the Russian planes, the Yak-3 and the WWII are the most easily found. The MiG is probably the hardest, at least in diecast 1/72. So with that, which one do you like, both in real life and the model? It's been a lot of fun to try to find these, and these are all relatively inexpensive, even the SkyMax. So, not something that'll break the bank, as it were. And there's just something very interesting about Russian history on these things. And this is just a very brief synopsis. There's very much a lot of interesting historical footnotes about all these aircraft. So, if you're interested, this is not even scratching the surface. Well, I appreciate you staying with me and watching all 3 parts. And if you please could like, share, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.